Today I'm going to be talking about embracing open source collection. For many of you, you're probably aware of the collection mechanisms that are already provided by Sumo Logic to get data, whether it's the installed collector, which is a Java application that we package up, or the hosted collectors. And as I talk today, my goal is to accomplish three things. I want to talk about what open source collection is, just get the idea in your head. I want to talk about why you would want to use open source collection, how it works, and convince you that there may be instances where it's actually the best solution for you. So what is this open source collection? So anybody here familiar with FluentD? CollectD. Okay, so we've actually heard, some of you have heard of open source collection. So let me backtrack a little bit. As we move towards containers and microservices, and essentially having smaller bits of compute that we're monitoring, we've been moving down this chain. But in the past, as we had fewer machines, the ability to monitor the machines was facilitated by the fact that the logs were in fewer places for us to look. So we could use tools like grep. We could also take advantage of, if our SSH skills were high enough, then we could possibly SSH across multiple machines. As time went by, people started to utilize things like syslog to aggregate logs into a single place. And eventually a concept of a logging layer has sort of come into being, where we've started to think of the data. I'm going to refer to it as data, not just logging, but we have started to think of it, the data that's coming out of our systems as a layer that we can manage. And at its most basic level, it works in the form of, we have inputs, we have some sort of a collection mechanism, and we have outputs. And this translates into, in the open source community, and even with our solution, this translates into inputs that can bring data from various sources, can poll if need be, and can get that information into our collector, and then can spit it out to various endpoints. So I want to take a couple of minutes and talk about who the tools are, or what the tools are that exist. On the metrics side of the house, I'm going to talk about this in the paradigm of metrics and logs, but I want to make it clear that this data layer is sort of merging, and so traditionally these tools are metrics only, and I'm going to talk about some tools that are traditionally logs only, but that's actually sort of blending, and so people are beginning to make the decision that they want to have those combined. So CollectD and Telegraph are very similar. I'm going to talk about them together. They're open source tools for collecting metrics. Some of you, I think, are familiar with them, and they allow you to gather metrics from various sources by utilizing inputs that drive data into CollectD, and then outputs that help to get it out. And we've actually built, at Sumo Logic, we've actually built output plugins for these tools that you can put in play with CollectD and Telegraph to get data into Sumo Logic. I think it might have been a year ago, maybe more than a year ago, the HTTP source on our hosted collectors was enabled to receive graphite and carbon-2 formatted metrics, and not just logs. Whenever we and when we did that, it opened up the possibility of working with these open source metrics collectors. Prometheus, when I talk about Prometheus, I have to talk about it a little bit differently, because these other metrics collection mechanisms worked on a mechanism where essentially you would subscribe to a sync from them and they would push the metrics out. Prometheus, by show of hands, how many people are familiar with Prometheus? Okay, a couple of people are it's different in that Prometheus works on a pull-based model. I'm actually giving a talk after this about monitoring Kubernetes, and I'm going to talk more about how the mechanism that works, but on a high level, essentially endpoints are made available, and instead of you subscribing and having the metrics pushed out to you, the endpoints are available, and you poll them on whatever interval you want, and the metrics are available, and you can process out or decorate whatever ones you want in order to get those into your collector, and then into whatever tool afterwards. On the log side of the house, and as I mentioned earlier, these log solutions, many of them people are beginning to write inputs and outputs plugins for these tools that facilitate metrics. So I talk about them as logging tools because originally that's what they were, but they have started to handle metrics as well. So FluentD and Logstash are very similar in their functionality. You provide inputs, or you implement inputs that have been built by the community, and they get the data into the collector, and then you can ship them out to various outputs. So this is my diagram to just sort of point out how this mechanism works. Because we have enabled the ability to get metrics in, not just using our collector, using our HTTP source. This means that whatever inputs that you have, or whatever collector you want to use, you can now use with Sumo Logic. I mean, I talk about it like it's a new concept. It's not actually a new concept. The ability to do this has been around for a long time. We just haven't talked about it a whole lot. In fact, I don't know. By the way, is anyone here using one of these open source collectors to actually get data into Sumo Logic today? Oh, great. I want to talk to you all because I actually haven't met anyone who's doing it yet. I probably should have consulted some more of the engineers at Sumo Logic to see to get a polling of who had done it. So I'm going to be speaking specifically about FluentD today. I'm going to be showing some examples of how to do it with FluentD. And then we can get into some concepts that I want to share, and hopefully we can have a discussion afterwards. So first, my meme. So if we can interface as an output for an open source collector, then all of the inputs for that open source collector are now inputs for Sumo Logic. And the reason why this is really beneficial is because these open source collectors have been around for years, and people have been building, maybe some of you have built some of the input plugins for these collectors. I know when I was putting together my list of icons, one of the ones I was missing was Redis over here. And when I was presenting, when I was showing my slides internally, someone said, you've got to put Redis on there, because that's one of our most frequently asked for input. Like, how do we get Redis into Sumo Logic? And I didn't have an answer. And they said, FluentD, go FluentD, go Google for FluentD and technology. And most of the time you're going to find that someone has built a plugin that will get this into FluentD. And because we have our FluentD to Sumo Logic output plugin, now you can get all of these things in a neat package into Sumo Logic. Some of them we already handle, but using FluentD can kind of standardize it. A personal story, and a little background about myself. I probably should have done this at the beginning. So I was a Sumo Logic customer for 3.5 years, working at a company as a DevOps engineer, just doing automation with VMware and Windows and Linux, and we had a very diverse stack. And about a little over a year ago, I joined Sumo Logic and have loved it ever since. Almost a year ago, we had a customer who came to us. I originally started as a sales engineer for Sumo Logic, and we had a customer who came to us and said, "Hey, we've got Heroku, and we want to get those logs into Sumo Logic." Well, great, that's awesome, because Heroku has syncs, and you can point those syncs to go to one of our HTTP collectors, and you can get the logs into Sumo Logic. This, which is great, right? The problem is more or less solved. I want to point something out. I'm going to come back to the Heroku story in just a minute. So when we're configuring these FluentD configurations, and this example is going to work with Logstash as well, the methodology is fairly similar. We have inputs and outputs, and there's some other stuff in the middle that I'll talk about in a little more detail later, but essentially it's input and output. So here we can see that I have an input. The type is a tail, which is just a file source. That's the equivalent of file source, is just tailing a file. And it pulls in there's some parameters that are set up on this one, and then it is paired up with this output. Inputs are sources in FluentD, and outputs are these matches, or we'll call them that. There's a little asterisk there. And this type points at my HTTP endpoint that I've configured. Another example here is I have an HTTP source So just like we have HTTP sources in the cloud that you can hit, with FluentD you can set up a local HTTP source. It works very much like an even more generic syslog endpoint, and data that you direct to it goes into FluentD. You can do whatever foo you want in there. I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And then you can direct it out. So these two outputs that I have set up here are for our Sumo Logic type, but our output doesn't just do logs. You can also configure it to do metrics. So if the data is coming in and it's a metric of whatever type, you can specify to take one of these two paths to come into Sumo Logic, and it will format it and then package it up and send it to Sumo Logic. So here's an example of using Kafka. We've got a Kafka input, and we have our Sumo Logic output. And once you have these set up, it's fairly easy. This is going to stay the same. More or less, this is going to stay the same. And you can just choose from the library. There are several thousand input plugins in the configuration. By the way, I'm not a Kafka or a Redis expert, so hopefully someone has some and this makes sense to you. But here's a Redis input. And there are actually a handful of them. I grabbed the one that looked the least complicated to me. So this is the Redis slow log plugin. And again, we have our same output to Sumo Logic. So here is here's some questions that I ask myself. So why would you want an open source collector? Well, to kind of sum up, if there are things that you're trying to do and you talk to one of our sales engineers and they say, man, that's a good question, I would challenge you to say, you know what, I wonder if there's an open source collector solution for it now. This is a very good use case. If you're finding it that you're sort of having to reinvent the wheel in order to get a source into Sumo Logic, it may be a good candidate for using an open source collector because those plugins have been built for you. And what if you're happy with what you have now? Fine, keep what you have now. I want to do anything. I want to do anything but deride the collector that we have. The collector that we have out of the box is great. I'll admittedly say there are some things that are not so cool about it. It does cause a footprint. For some of our customers who are using really old hardware, you may have problems running I think the requirement is your operating system needs to run Java 1.8 now. And that's modern stuff, but we don't always have, we're not always in charge of what infrastructure we're having to handle. And so we've had some customers with struggles still monitoring things that are like server 2003 or earlier. And so that can be a tricky thing, or even point of sales devices. It can be tricky to get collection out of those devices as well. But that aside, I'm happy to have people continue to use the open source, our collector. We'll continue to support it, and it does a lot of things that are really great. One of my favorite things about it is sort of hidden behind this is our collector, and it's going to sound lame, I think, when I say it, but it's key when you get into it. Our collector does a really good job of magically identifying where the time is in those messages. Whether it's an epoch time or it's one of the trillion different standards of writing out a date, our collector is very robust in figuring out where the date is, what the time zone is, and getting it so that your records can appear in Sumo Logic. I don't know if any of you have ever run into the problem when you were configuring something and the time zone was off, and so your records ended up in the future or the past, and you're like, I just turned that machine off, why are there still logs coming from it, you know? So our collector does some things really well. And the other thing that it does even better than the time is a buffer layer. So if you're having some sort of network issues or connectivity issues to Sumo Logic, the installed collector is able to cache in a way that is more robust than some of these open source solutions. By the way, that's one of the things I hope as a contributor that I'd like to improve on, is to increase the robustness of the buffering that comes from these open source solutions. And finally, isn't it just another collector? Yes, it is just another collector. 3 weeks into using Sumo Logic as a customer, I had all sorts of crazy things that I wanted to do with Sumo Logic. And my boss wisely didn't let me do any of them because they were just too crazy. And as I've been at Sumo Logic, I like to think I've gotten the reputation of the guy who gets to do crazy stuff and has some interesting solutions to problems. They're not always the solution someone's going to pick, but it's like, hey, that would technically work. But I want to propose some ideas to y'all about things that you can do with an open source collector that you cannot do readily with our collector. So, let me point out a couple of things. First off, our collector doesn't let you natively point data to more than one output. It's more or less only pointed at Sumo Logic. There's a little asterisk there. You can point to another collector, or you can do some interesting things, and once the data's in Sumo Logic, you can actually redirect it for cold storage to S3 or to various places. That's fine, but you're not capable with our current collector to, someone correct me if I'm wrong, but with our current collector, there's not a mechanism for you to essentially say, hey, I need to T this, and I need some of it, I need an exact copy to go to S3 for compliance, and also some of it to go to Sumo Logic. By the way, I'm not insinuating that sending a test would get you out of compliance, but when I talk about some of the other stuff in a second, you're going to understand why I'm mentioning this one first. So we have inputs. Whatever the inputs are, you use your open source collector, and because we've built the output plugins for all of them, you can get it to us, and you can also get it, sorry I touched the mic, you can also get it to whatever the other outputs are that you might be concerned with. So what are these other things that I'm talking about? So oftentimes I have run into customers who are running into an issue where they have two buckets of things they want to bring to Sumo Logic. And one of them, let's just for easy numbers, one of them is 30 of their 100 units of pipe, and the other one is 70. They don't want to buy 100 gigs to get the data in. They really only want, like, of this 70 portion, it's not as valuable to them. They don't need, say, let's imagine that it's access logs. Let's say that they say, we want to prioritize 500s, 400s, 300s over 200s. Or we want to prioritize errors and warns over infos, or whatever that thing is. And so what an open source collector will allow you to do is to say, hey, and you can do this, by the way, you can do some of this with our processing rules in our installed and hosted collectors, but you have greater control over this in an open source collector, so you can effectively sample. You can sample in ways that are not very easy to do with our collector. For instance, I've had people who've said, hey, I know that for security reasons, VPC flow always seems to come up because it's such a daggum verbose source of data. And they say, hey, for security reasons, I know I really need everything, but we're not there. But I still want to be able to monitor traffic so that I can make decisions about my environment based on the data that's there. But if you say I got to bring everything in, then I'm going to bring nothing in because it's outside of my budget. And so my solution is, in the past, has been, hey, why don't you write a little regex that finds the second of the timestamp and then only allows stuff to come in if the second is a 1 or a 2 or a 3 or a 4 or whatever, and you can choose how many digits you want to include, and then you can effectively sample. You want 10% of your messages? Great, say it's only a 1 and you only get the messages that came in during the 1 second of any 10 seconds, which is hacky at best. To use our processing rules because they're not intended to be used that way, even though you can. With the open source collectors, and I'm more of an expert on FluentD if I'm an expert on any of them. They provide mechanisms for you to do filtering using Ruby, using Lua, using C. So if you have some sort of funky filtering mechanism that you want to do, you can totally write that in. And I've only mentioned input plugins and output plugins, but there are also filter plugins and buffer plugins and a handful of other transformative plugins that are available that you can take advantage of. My focus has just been on inputs and outputs, but I want to talk about some of the things that you can do natively with these tools. So I've talked about sampling. What about sampling, but in the other direction? Imagine you're a customer, or imagine that you have a set of data. I don't even remember now what it was, but I had a customer who had a set of data where somebody here is going to go, I know what that is. Where the last 2 fields of every single record were TLS 1.2 space, and then whatever the algorithm was for the encryption. Out of the average 150 characters that message, a full 30 of them were the exact same characters, every single message. And every single message had that same stamp. because all of their stuff was encrypted. They didn't actually need to do it. With the use of an open source collector, you could effectively excise out those fields if you don't want them. Conversely, you can enrich. So currently we have lookup tables as a functionality if you're familiar with our query language, and you can hit some lookup table that you've prepared. You can append data to your records. We don't allow you currently to do it in a field extraction rule, so you can't create permanent extra fields on a piece of data for someone else to consume. With an open source collector, that's possible. If you want to, I had a customer recently who needed to know, without involving developers, we all know that if you ask developers to do a thing, even if they are your favorite person and you've given them all the cookies they've demanded, they can't get something into production in less than 6 months. There's just too many hoops for them to jump through, and then there's QA, and then you have to bribe those guys, and it can be really, really slow. And so I had a customer recently who wanted to be able to see what is the version of the code, my app, that actually emitted this log. And we created a solution in Sumo Logic which there's a couple different ways to do it. We created a solution in Sumo Logic that appended that data when the records came in, using a field extraction rule, literally just making up a field. Problem was that they had to keep on updating the field extraction rule, and because we're promising API first, the field extraction rules via API is something that'll come in the future. We could even do it by appending things using another solution that we could have used was by creating a processing rule and hackily appending data to the end of it. The problem is those processing rules, it's not a scalable thing. But with open source collectors, you can do that kind of stuff. If you want to enrich the data, if you need to do some sort of logic, hey, if it says info, but it also says client over here, then I don't want that record. Right now, with our collector, you can't do those kind of conditionals. And with an open source collector, essentially the world's an oyster. You can enrich, filter, slice and dice, sample, whatever you'd like to do. And the main reason why I wanted to give this talk is because the kinds of things that I can cook up is limited to just me. And I want other people to be thinking about these things. And I invite you to join me on the dojo. I'm Kenneth-Sumo Logic on the Sumo Logic dojo. I want to hear your ideas. I want to see how you're using it. I actually am waiting to talk to the guy from WAG who did something similar to what I'm talking about here, using a modified Lambda function in S3 so that he could selectively filter through his VPC flow logs before ingesting them into Sumo Logic. So I provided these slides will be available later. So, but I've put links to some of these resources that I'm using, and that's all I have to present. We've got time for, I believe we have time for questions. If anybody's got any questions.
Yes, you have lots of time for questions. Thanks, Kenneth.
There's a question right here.
Yeah, lift your hand. I'll bring the mic.
I have a question about Sumo and Prometheus.
Sumo on premises?
And Prometheus.
Oh, and Prometheus, okay.
Yeah. So I was looking to set up metric ingestions from our Kubernetes cluster into Sumo.
Yeah.
I found basically a Kubernetes application that would, if configured correctly with all the endpoints, it would scrape them and send them to Sumo.
Yeah.
What I didn't find is something that would update those endpoints when they change, which, as you said, as you know, they come and go, and it's not static.
Absolutely. So, funnily enough, I'm giving another talk in like half an hour or an hour, and it's called How to Monitor Kubernetes. And I'm
going there.
I'm talking specifically about pulling metrics and data out of Kubernetes. So if you're okay, we can talk about that in that talk, and hopefully you'll make me feel less nervous when I'm giving it. Any other questions?
Great talk, Kenneth. Can you just go back one slide so we can see the resources again?
Sure.
Any other questions?
Another one about FluentD.
Sure.
So we're using Sumo Logic FluentD collector.
Okay.
Recently noticed, actually today, that our kubelet logs are not, they're not being enriched with the metadata.
Yeah.
So, and I wasn't sure if that's something that...
Is it just the kubelet logs that are not being enriched? Or is it all the logs from Kubernetes aren't being enriched?
So these are logs from syslog.
And when you talk about enrichment, are you talking
I'm
about
talking like...
all the JSON metadata fields?
Yes.
Okay.
It's basically just whatever was in syslog. And the collector name is like HTTP input, the source category HTTP input. So there is no easy way to segment those logs by, say, environment or something
Okay.
like that.
So I know that most of those parameters are configurable. I think it's laid out. It may not, maybe we need to improve the documentation, but many of those things are configurable, and it's laid out in the documentation on the Kubernetes plugin. It gets updated. We should talk. Sorry, I'm getting a little hoarse. We should talk a little later. But I'm wondering if, or just tell me real quick. Are you using the most recent version?
We're one behind. So
You're
we're
one
117. Your right now latest is 118.
Okay. And I wish I would be presenting this with another guy, Frank, who's actually our Kubernetes. He built the tooling, and he could answer this question. Why don't we chat afterwards, and I'll get you and I in contact with Frank, because I want to hear what he has to say about this as well.
Yeah, that sounds good. If Frank and Kenneth can help you troubleshoot, right?
Yeah.
Any other questions?
Right here on the front, Dave.
Yeah, I'm curious. So, like, the idea of using FluentD instead of the collector actually sounds very appealing to me, because I have some, like, in my deployment, I've now solved them, right? But, like, I had some, like, minor issues and continue to have minor issues around, like, collector installation, basically, like, every time I bring up a VM and, like, so I'm curious, though, because I'm also an extensive user of, like, CollectD, because when I started using metrics, like, actually, with you guys, CollectD was sort of my only option, right? Like, to get stuff in, because I was early in the beta. And so I use CollectD a lot, but, like, one of the consequences of that has been that, like, up until, like, the metrics rules existed, I was sort of like a second-class citizen in a lot of ways with my metrics, right? Because, like, there were no fields extracted right, and, like, certain functionality didn't really work, as maybe intended, right? So would I run into any similar things like that with FluentD if I were to use that instead of the Sumo Logic Collector?
You mean are you asking what are the cons to using an
I
open
guess
source
sort of
collector?
what are the cons?
Sure.
Like what functionality am I going to miss out on because of that?
The first one that comes to mind is the buffering. So we have very robust buffering. We'll essentially use as much as you'll allow us to ensure that the buffer continues to fill until there's connectivity and we can actually dump that data to Sumo Logic. And the same priority to not dropping data doesn't exist. I'm not saying like, we couldn't connect and it just like deletes everything, but the same priority towards buffer does not exist in the collectors. And so in some rare instances, you could find yourself where you were running out of. You'd have to address that into, hey, I want to buffer more.
Yeah, I'll take that a bit. I manage the collection team as well. So there are some, Kenneth gave you some reasons why. So the collector is quota aware. So the collector participates in the whole budget management and the quota management. And so if you kind of reach to some level, the quota the collector is aware of it and is going to like paste the ingest and it's going to save to disk. The other thing is it will do retries, right? Automatically. Some of the open source libraries don't always do retries very well, and like exponential retries and things like that. The HTTP source, it's a fire and forget in a way, right? So if the server is not able to accept your data and your client is not able to buffer or retry, the data is gone, right? The collector takes care of a lot of that. The other aspect that's nice about the collector, compared to an open source software, it's all cloud managed, right? So all the configuration is stored in servers, in our servers. So that's an aspect that some of our customers really appreciate. So
And you'd also miss having the API. But as far you'll notice, and correct me if I'm wrong, but one of the things you'll notice is we're not saying that once the data is in Sumo Logic, you're going to have a different experience. Because once the data is in Sumo, we treat it just like anything else. I'm talking about logs now, right? Metrics is not, Metrics is one of our newer products, comparatively speaking. And so we're still making improvements on that. So there, some of the headaches that you've run into are things that we're working on addressing. But on the log side, the experience inside Sumo Logic is going to be the same. Yeah.
No difference between, like any source of data, once it's in Sumo, it's treated the same, right? We have Cloud Syslog, we have HTTP, we have the collector, we have S3, we have some integration with Office 365 and Google, right? So all of that, once the data is in, it goes through the same pipeline.
Yeah, and we've sort of baked in, whether it's hosted or installed, we've baked in some of the configuration management. And you'd need to, there would be a paradigm shift in switching to one of these open source collectors on how that happens, whether it's FluentD or Logstash. How you configure that collection is fundamentally different than using our API and running it. So.
Yeah, no, that sounds great because because actually, like most of those features you described, like no offense, but like my environment, basically, like I don't care about those things, right? Like I'm okay if I run so many servers, like if one server I lose the logs for it for some dumb reason, I don't care because whatever, right? If I don't have connectivity, I have bigger problems, right? So so that's actually really good to hear because like I say, like at least in my deployment, like installing and managing right, I have thousands of collectors, right? And this also makes the collector I don't care about the collector management interface because I'm not going to go in there and do anything with them, right? So, So okay, so thank you.
Any other questions?
So is it possible to write our own plugin to using Sumo API to put in our own collector? We have our own collector, but we send to the Kafka. Is it easier to write something sent to Sumo Logic?
So are you trying to say you want to send Kafka into Sumo Logic?
No, instead of sending to Kafka and sending to Sumo Logic directly from our own collector.
Yeah, absolutely. These open source collectors allow for that kind of functionality.
So we all have our own collector, not open source collector.
Does your collector allow? Yes. Well, we should talk for specifics, but does your collector allow you to push out to via REST, like to perform HTTP calls?
Yes.
Then yes. The answer is yes.
But you don't have the plugin right away. We have to write our own things to wrap up the RESTful call and that stuff.
That's correct. We don't have a plugin, an output plugin for your open source for your collector, right? I don't even know what your collector is. But that being said, the HTTP endpoint is literally whatever the body is of the payload. That is the log. Whatever the body is, if you change the header to say that it's graphite or carbon formatted, then that becomes metric. There's nothing else fancy to do. Yeah.
Yeah. So we consider our HTTP endpoints and our Cloud Syslog endpoints APIs. Right. So if you can write a client that's using an API, then you can use our HTTP endpoint.
Yeah.
Any other questions? All right. Thank you. Please give a hand. You can go through.